just really wants to do. All right. So we'll begin with introductions, and then I haven't done an honors college thesis defense before, but I'm going to do it the same way as a PhD or an MA defense. And that is, we'll start out with a presentation from Shahnaz on her thesis, and that should take no more than about 15 minutes. And then the committee will ask you questions, beginning with Professor Westling. And then, time permitting, because I think we're within an hour and a half on this, we'll see if there are any questions from the audience. At a certain point, we will ask everyone to leave the room except members of the committee, and then I'll come back and get you. Okay? So it's scripted, you know, it's less complicated than it sounds. So why don't we start with the committee introducing itself. I'm Naomi Zach, and I've been Shahnaz's advisor on this project.
I'm Liz Westling from the English department.
And Roxanne Prosniak, History Honors College, and Shahnaz's advisor as well. And I think we're going to have to move around.
Okay.
So thank you for coming to my defense. And I was going to introduce all of you, but thank you for doing it already, and thank you for agreeing to be on my committee. I really enjoyed working with all of you and being in your classes. And, yeah, thank you for everything that you've done for me and beyond this thesis as well.
You can introduce the audience if you like.
Sure. My parents, Gigi and Bert.
Hello.
A lot of philosophy friends, Erin, Ben, Kelly, Aurora, Valeria. And my honors college friends, Cassandra and Michael. My boss at the honors college, Maria, and Nick, who's my partner. So implications and considerations of the use of antibiotics on both non-human and human populations. I'm going to defend my thesis in the following way. I'll present my main arguments that I made in my thesis project, and I will go into why this project is important in a greater context, how it situates itself within current problems in environmental and social inequities. And then I'm going to go into a summation of the project, talk about parts 1 and 2, how they're separate entities, but they're also interdependent and are interrelated, and that synthesis between them is extremely important for the project. I'll then talk about the conclusions of part 1, the conclusions of part 2, and then I'll add final remarks and discuss how this research opens up possibilities for other research and other questions and possibilities as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so my main arguments, in part 1, I evaluated utilitarianism, consequentialism, and deontology in regards to their usefulness in animal ethics. I concluded a deontological model is more sufficient for creating a new paradigm of non-human animal ethics because of its usefulness in evaluating the inherent dignity as opposed to suffering. And I'll go into why I came to those conclusions more in detail later. In part 2, I argued that the overuse and misuse of antibiotics in concentrated animal feeding operations poses an epidemic risk to human populations, and I suggested both domestic and international initiatives and norms to help combat the issue. Slide, please. So why did I choose to pursue this question? This project is important in both its methods and its content. As my readers know, I synthesized a lot of different fields. I brought together science, philosophy, environmental studies, and public policy, and I really thought that in order to really consider what this question means, what the antibiotic use in CAFOs really mean, then I should come at it at different lenses. In the world of 2014, I really think that the biggest issues that plague our society, such as the global climate crisis, really need an interdisciplinary approach because the origins of the problems are so multifaceted and complex, and this is an example of one of those issues. Although I did focus my research primarily on antibiotic use in concentrated animal feeding operations, I think it is one symptom of greater cause. So it's not just that there's a drive for profit, and it's not just that we have poor husbandry practices in the United States, but it really is a symptom of the extreme instrumentalist paradigm that we have ourselves in, relating humans and non-humans, and the way that we situate our relationship with them. I really thought that this project was really exciting to me because it really asked the question of, is this a domestic issue, an international issue? And it really is a global issue. When bacterium do come up with resistance, they're not just contained within national boundaries. They don't see national boundaries. And so it's really important for every country to really consider the implications of their use of antibiotics because it is a global threat, even if it is just bred in the United States. Just hit slide, please. Okay. Before I get too in depth, I want to go over some terminology and some just basic information for you to understand the project and why I chose to do it as well. So the first one is, what is a CAFO? You've probably heard me use the acronym already. It stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. And they're operations, large operations, that house 1,000 animal units for a minimum of 45 days. And hit slide, please. This chart shows the different differentiations between large, medium, and small CAFOs. And it depends on, an animal unit depends on the species of animal. So you can see, there are different configurations, if it's a dairy cow or a veal calf, for example. So that's kind of the brief definition of what a CAFO is. There are about 9,900 CAFOs in the United States currently. Okay, slide please. So the next question is, what is the estimated use? What is the scope of the use in the United States, for example? So because there are really no regulations about the amount of transparency that CAFOs need to provide, different organizations and researchers have estimated that amount of antibiotics used in CAFOs. So you can hit the next slide, please. So the U.S. Food and Drug Administration estimates that there were 29.9 million pounds of antibiotics sold in the United States for non-human animal use. And this is contrasted with the 7.7 million sold for human illness. And so this is a consideration we need to keep in mind. The United States, per kilogram of meat produced, we use the most milligrams of antibiotics out of any country in the world. So even though this is a global issue like I was talking about, it is particular in the United States that we do have a lot of antibiotic use that is not consistent with other Western nations and other nations around the world. Next slide. I also wanted to discuss the four main reasons why antibiotics are used in CAFOs. So there are definitions between therapeutic and non-therapeutic uses. So therapeutic uses are used to treat sick animals, to control outbreaks, things like that. And an example of a non-therapeutic use would be for the use of promoting growth. So it's been found that animals are able to grow up to 3%, 1 to 3% larger than they would normally if they are fed regularly through their food and water antibiotic medication. And so that's one non-therapeutic use, which is the most attacked in this debate, whether it should be used for growth. And I'll talk about the problems between defining what is used for growth and what is used for preventing outbreak, for example. So what is antibiotic resistance? I'll briefly go through this. If you could hit this slide, please. So antibiotic resistance is a natural phenomenon. It happens in natural systems without any human intervention, but because CAFOs operate in the way that they do, the resistance is developed at a faster rate. And so antibiotics, there are one of two ways that they work. One way is they try to kill the cell, the entire cell. One is that they try to inhibit cell growth. And so if the cell is not completely destroyed by an antibiotic, part of that antibiotic is left over. And as they begin to replicate, they can replicate the same information to make it resistant in the next generations. So that's why it's really a problem. And I wanted to show you this chart because the amount of antibiotics that we are developing is seriously dwindling from the 1980s. They really have been wonder drugs, and they've really helped the United States, but also a lot of different countries combat illness. And there are a lot of explanations of why this trend is happening, but in my research I found two main ways why this is occurring. So one of them is because the amount of complexity is needed to create new antibiotic medications. In one of the readings, in one of my literature sources, someone said that in the 1980s we got the low-hanging fruit of antibiotic medication. We developed the easiest antibiotic medications, but now they're becoming more complex. So it is harder to develop them, but then also the profit for pharmaceutical companies is not there anymore. It's not profitable for pharmaceutical companies to want to develop a lot of these, and so it's a challenge for-profit pharmaceutical companies and how to drive them to create this antibiotic medication. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the summation of the project, I'd like to talk about parts 1 and 2 and why I split them into parts 1 and 2. Like I said, part 1 is solely about non-human animal ethics and really considering this problem from a non-human animal ethic. In the debates about regulation of antibiotics, it really hasn't been mentioned what the antibiotics do to animals, what the consequences, the concrete and also philosophical considerations are around this issue. And then part 2 is about human epidemiology. And it really focuses on human health and why this is a public health issue and why it needs to be seriously considered in policy, specifically in the United States. Like I said, they are two distinct parts, but this issue is multifaceted. So it needs to be considered from a lot of different approaches. It needs to be considered from the point of view of the non-human animals that it's harming, but also the humans that it has potential to harm. And so I really want to urge you to think about how those two are interrelated and how they interplay one another. The conceptual piece you saw coming in, I did that part because I wanted to greater synthesize the two parts. I wanted to leave it ambiguous, and I wanted to really question our relation with non-human animals and how we negotiate that. My methods, I use philosophical texts, scientific literature, congressional hearings, and I also relied on reports from organizations like the Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization. Next slide, please. Sorry. Part 1 include the need to turn to a deontological model to really combat how we treat non-human animals, and then also in light of this issue, how it can be used. Utilitarianism, which is based upon Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, aims to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Bentham outlines about 7 factors in the evaluation of a right or wrong action, and his principle of utility is based upon quantitative hedonism. Mill is more concerned with the distinction between higher and lower pleasures, higher pleasures being pleasures that derive from intellectual capacity and also cognitive ability. His lower pleasures include physical satisfaction and manual labor, and this creates a hierarchy of structure. Who gets to enjoy the higher pleasures, who doesn't? How can we know if someone is experiencing a higher pleasure through a physical way? So those were kind of part of the problematic parts of that. Peter Singer, who really ignited the animal liberation movement in the 1970s, relies upon a utilitarian model to argue that non-humans should not be treated the way that they do in the meat and dairy industry. He relies both upon Bentham and Mill's considerations of utilitarianism. I also talk about consequentialism, and consequentialism is a strand of utilitarianism that evaluates the rightness or wrongness of an action dependent on the consequences it produces. So it's not reliant on the agent or their motives, but solely on what it produces, if it produces a right or wrong action. So I argue that utilitarianism and consequentialism ultimately fail to produce better values and norms because they reduce all non-human animals to a single group with a single interest. So it doesn't differentiate between a squid and an octopus, for example. All animals are grouped into this one term. Quantitative and qualitative hedonism are vague and hierarchical, like I was talking about, and they are and can be used to reinforce the prioritization of human life over non-human life. Thus, the project turns its attention to deontology for an answer to this question. Although Kant, in his text, does not regard non-human animals as worthy of moral considerations in themselves, the deontological model has been applied through deep ecology. Deep ecology recognizes the inherent dignity of all humans, non-humans, and inanimate surrounding environment. While deep ecology has been criticized because it disregards sometimes the importance of human life and essentializes both human nature and gender roles, I think it ultimately has the ability to create change in the instrumentalist paradigm that we're currently situated in. Some ways deep ecologist notions can be accepted and implemented is through the use of language, changing our language to break down the human-non-human distinction, and also the recognition of the interdependence between social and environmental degradation, and really taking seriously how humans and non-humans are part of the same environment and how they're plagued by similar issues and how we understand that. So in summation, although utilitarianism has been helpful to bring non-human animal rights into the public consciousness, it ultimately fails and perpetuates the same paradigm that we find ourselves in. A deontological approach, such as through deep ecology, has the ability to bring forth new norms and values. Part 2. Like I said, the aim of Part 2 was to really consider it through a human public health lens, and this is how it has been presented currently in debates recently, stemming from about 2006, I believe. The Data Act, which is currently a new form, is in Congress right now. That's how it's been framed. So it's a human public health issue. This needs to change because it is an epidemic risk. So non-human animals and CAFOs are administered many of the same antibiotics to treat human illness. And while they're not all the same, the penicillins, ionophores, and tetracyclines are some of the most prevalent used and also are used for human illness. And so once the bacterium in the CAFO develops resistance to those medications, that means that they don't work for humans as well. So it's not just building resistance to a couple bacteria that have no threat to us, it's actually a very great threat to human populations. So it's estimated about half of the antibiotics actually in CAFOs administered to non-human animals are almost identical in biological makeup to those prescribed to humans. So that's something to keep keep in mind about why this is an important issue. Antibiotic resistance is not just a projected threat, but has had real-life concrete consequences already. Several organizations, epidemiologists, and scientists, such as the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control, have made public statements about their hesitation and their concern about resistance. And these studies are based on peer-reviewed studies from multiple countries, such as the United States. Transmission of bacterial infections from CAFOs can occur through direct and indirect contact. So one of the ways that direct contact happens is through immediate contact with infected animals. So people who are on the ground working with the animals are at risk for infection, and also their families. There's been one study to suggest their families have higher rates of MRSA, which is one of the pathogens that is most prevalent. So it has already had an effect. Another method of transmission is through the contamination of food. According to the National Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System, about 80% of meat randomly tested shows traces of antibiotic resistance. And this causes a lot of issues currently in the United States. A lot of it can be mitigated through proper cleaning, proper cooking, things like that of meat, but it still poses a risk if those methods aren't properly handled. CAFOs are not closed-loop systems, so they produce a lot of manure and waste. It's estimated, there have been a couple different estimates. The highest is that CAFOs produce 130 times more waste than human populations do on an annual basis. I think the lowest I've heard is about 40 times as much. So those are very vast numbers, but the statement is still there that they're producing a lot more waste than even human populations do. And this is a risk because that manure can create dead zones in aquatic environments. It can contaminate surface water, groundwater, and it can spread pathogens in that way. Fecal matter is also very important in terms of the spreading of pathogens. a lot of the animals who are administered the antibiotics cannot metabolize the antibiotic fully. And so when they excrete their waste, often even the whole pill, the antibiotic medication, can be seen in their waste. And so it's not properly metabolized. So when it goes out into the environment, you're pretty much getting a lot of the whole medication that they were originally administered. So that's a very significant health risk. There have been studies, but it seems that there are more studies about the ecological risk of antibiotic medications in terms of ecosystems, how it affects aquatic populations, things like that. Like I said before, antibiotic resistance is an issue that really affects and transcends national boundaries. So because the United States is not a closed-loop system either, what we do in this country has significant effects on the rest of the world. A lot of countries in the European Union have taken more steps to reduce the amount of antibiotics and the kind of antibiotics that are used in CAFOs. Denmark is one exception to the rule that has really taken very severe steps to regulate the amount of antibiotics, and that's currently a example that a lot of people appeal to. Personally, in my research, I think it's a great example of what can be done, but because of the size of their country, the size of their industry, I think there still needs to be further research into what really the consequences of those are, but they have seen lower rates of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in most of their facilities. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So on a national scale, in the United States, I think there's several requirements outstanding, such as transparency, what is going on in these facilities, what medication is actually being used and why they're being used. A measure of what constitutes, like I said, prevention as opposed to growth. A lot of people on the other side who are arguing for the use of antibiotics appeal to both one, scientific uncertainty, but also human health. And they argue that actually using antibiotics in that way protects human health because they're preventing outbreak or controlling outbreak. And I think that's a very valid point. But I think that in terms of getting meaningful legislation passed, there needs to be more research to suggest what is used for growth and what is used for prevention. Like I said, there needs to be more emphasis on scientific literacy. So the American public and also our legislators need to take more responsibility for being aware of what is pseudoscience, what is science, how it does give us information about the world that can't be derived in any other fashion, and really go to the source instead of relying on secondary sources for their information about this issue, and also other issues such as the global climate crisis. I also appeal to the precautionary principle, which basically states that we should take actions that mitigate possible risk, even though for the short term it's less beneficial to do so. And so, in the short term, meat may be more expensive, but in the long term, when you add in healthcare costs, things associated with human health, it may very well be less expenditure on the American public. Globally, I argue that there should be open source, open patent labs. A lot of times, for-profit pharmaceutical industries are really geared towards countries that can afford to buy their product. And so there have been a couple initiatives on a global scale to create open source, open patent labs. And I feel that that's a more fair, equal way to do that. So countries who aren't in the most powerful economic positions can afford antibiotic medication if there is an epidemic that occurs. A lot of what drove this project initially was thinking about disaster preparation and preparedness and mitigation, and really how we can take that seriously and meaningfully. And I took Dr. Zach's class on philosophy of disaster, and that's really what fuels this project. And so, really being prepared on a citizen level, on a state level, and on a global level for epidemics, and how that can be meaningful in this issue. So, you can change slides. So just final remarks. Like I said, the aim of this project was to synthesize a lot of different realms in order to evaluate the use of antibiotics in concentrated animal feeding operations. I argued for a utilitarian model as opposed to argued for a deontological model as opposed to a utilitarian or consequentialist model in order to come up with a better animal ethic, a non-human animal ethic. My conclusions were a synthesis of philosophical and also concrete solutions. I talked about the use of language, but then also having open source, open patent labs, and so really synthesizing both kinds of solutions. And like I said, I think that this project really opens the door to further research and further consideration on this issue. The clock may or may not be ticking. I know that there is uncertainty about if or when an epidemic will occur, but if we're prepared and we have evaluated this issue through multiple lenses, I believe that we will be more ready to properly address an epidemic if and when it occurs because of antibiotic resistance. So thank you, and I will now open the floor to my professor's questions.
Thank you. Shahnaz, if you could have a seat, maybe the committee will interrogate you.
Yeah, links would be great.
Fascinating project with more complexity than can be handled in a book, but you did a good job considering the constraints of the scope of your project. I have lots of questions which I won't torture you with, but I'll ask just a couple. One is, for the lay reader, could you define deontology?
Yes. So deontology is basically the respect of, it's a moral theory that basically respects the inherent dignity and inherent worth of, well, with Kant, it was in a person, and that was based upon their rational will. And only rational creatures were able to participate in this deontological model and this categorical imperative because they were rational and they were able to conceive of obligation with others and things like that.
Okay, in line with that, part of that question, I would like to ask you, you do extend Kant to non-human animals somewhat. I want to ask you about the cat who was on YouTube last week or the week before, who saved a 3 or 4-year-old boy from a dog. It attacked the dog and drove it away. Do you think the cat and dog had autonomous wills or not?
I think that if I'm looking for a Kantian perspective, if I'm taking exactly what he said, I would probably say no. That they wouldn't have autonomous wills. They're more directed by their impulse more than anything.
A cat has an impulse to attack a dog because of the child.
I mean, that's debatable.
Okay.
There may be, I think there's an epistemic limit to saying, what we can know, like why did that cat attack that dog? There could be multiple reasons besides why, protecting the child. It seems like it is for protecting the child, but we don't know, and I think that was part of why I turned away from the higher and lower pleasures that Mill talks about, because we don't know if a pig, for example, experiences higher pleasures, and if it does have that cognitive ability. So I think that is one consideration. But I think that if we come through a deep ecology lens, I would definitely say, and the application that I appealed to in my thesis, I think that it could be argued that there was an autonomous will there. Like I said, there is that epistemic problem. But I think that deep ecologists, some strands of deep ecology that are more focused on non-human animal ethics could make the argument that there was an emotional attachment, for example, maybe to the child, or that they saw another being in distress and then they came to their help.
So let me just add, I think, I've been wondering about that episode as well, because it seems like far more responsible behavior than you normally see with cats. But even if the cat was protecting the child, and I've heard people say that, cats, they've had cats and will protect them when they're young children, that wouldn't satisfy Kant, because what Kant in his original formulation requires through rationality is that the principle of your action can be a universal law. So, it's not the golden rule. It's not what if somebody did it to you, it's what if everybody did it. So you have to go through this mental gymnastic And that's what makes you a rational being, and that's what makes you capable of giving the law to yourself. That's what he means by autonomy. So obviously, he's not only restricting it to human beings, he's really restricting it to only some human beings. But that's not the aspect of Kant that we're working with. The aspect of Kant that we're working with is another formulation, which have been taken up in many contexts, including the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that is that every human is intrinsically valuable. So every person is intrinsically valuable and has a dignity. That's the thing that gets extended to animals. So we don't have to worry about whether they're autonomous. And we also want to, we want children to have dignities. We want people who are mentally challenged to have dignities, people who are unconscious, so on. So, even if they can't do cons.
Thanks. One more little question, and that is, the whole question about antibiotics in the first place. It's not what you were aiming to go after, but you do mention dualism here and there. And I just wonder about the whole basis of formulating antibiotics, because we are predominantly bacterial creatures ourselves. Hundreds and hundreds of bacteria in our mouths, neutralizing plant toxins, and hundreds in our intestines digesting food, and others going around cleaning up the pipes and so on. So what does it mean for your way of approaching this if suddenly we realize that it's not we who are messing with bacteria, we ourselves are part of the whole bacteria scene? Could there be another way of approaching this?
I thought a lot about what it means to be a being, and what constitutes being, what constitutes having the ability to have the inherent dignity and inherent worth that we were just talking about. And I think that would be extremely important, not just this context, but also biodiversity context. What does it mean to be biodiverse? What is an ecosystem, and if we should consider ecosystem health as opposed to individual unit health. I think that in deep ecology, some deep ecologists are really focused on ecosystem and forsake, human life, non-human life, things like that. And so I think it'd be very interesting to, have an approach, in terms of seeing ourselves as part as being biotic beings. And I think that at a certain point we do, but we definitely do create a dualism as well. We do create, us and then antibiotic resistant bacteria or pathogens or things like that. And I think that it is difficult to see that how they're important in human life when it causes so much human suffering as well. Pathogens currently and do affect so many people on an international scale and very, I think, unfairly. Countries and people who can't afford antibiotic medication are treated unfairly because of that inefficiency, because of that economic disparity. And so I think that there needs to be consideration in terms of what it means to be biotic and natural creatures, whatever natural may mean, but then also how that has concrete implications for human and non-human populations.
Thanks.
I really appreciated the way you set up your presentation by stating your problem first, and I didn't see that in the written part of the thesis. So one of the things I'm going to suggest is that you kind of flip that around. And really, you spent much more time in the written part. You're going over the philosophical ins and outs, and I think the structure that you gave us today might be a little sharper that way. So, just a general question. The capos, I assume that these come out of mostly cattle raising situations, and so I'm wondering, are they as common in a place like France or Germany? Or does this mostly come out of something that's kind of a particular U.S. industrial model for a lot of things, including education?
Well, I think, I think maybe in its origins it was very cattle-oriented, but I think on a global scale it's much more about poultry confinement and those issues. And so at least, considering what other countries do, I think that would be at this point a better species to look at.
Well, they do have, remember, what was it, hoof and mouth disease, where the UK had destroyed it's, it's beef, right?
Right.
But it doesn't kill them, that's a terrible thing. But now they could survive it, they just wouldn't have as much meat.
Well, they killed them so they wouldn't spread.
Yeah. So they're just things that are.
And there have been other scares throughout Europe. I think it's global, even in France.
I guess when I heard your question, I did hear Europe, and I also thought about at least my own experience in Asian countries, specifically Thailand and India, which I believe have much more of a poultry emphasis than a cattle emphasis.
Yeah.
But that's from my personal experience, and that's where my mind is gravitated towards at first. But yeah, I do definitely think that it is a global phenomenon, but I think in the United States, it's definitely at a much larger scale. Like I said, the United States uses significantly more antibiotics than any other country in the world. Even places that produce even more meat in certain ways, for certain species.
If you have any numbers on that, I think that's helpful also. Your chart is really.
Okay, my turn. So, I think you've done a very comprehensive and thorough job, considering that it's really a work that's fitting you all your own work in a relatively short period of time. So, what I'm interested in are the different moral systems that come into play in your consideration. And we talked about this a little bit, but I didn't ask you the question that I'm going to ask you now, because it didn't occur to me how to tie these things together until yesterday. So I would have asked you the question last time we met, but I didn't have it then. So all right, so what you find out, and it's kind of an inquiry you go through in the first part, which I think is really important, trying to see if you can apply what seems like the obvious moral system, which is a moral system that everybody seems to apply to animals and animal rights, especially since see if you can apply utilitarianism and consequentialism. And you come to the conclusion that you really can't, because harm to chickens is going to be different than harm to pigs. And not only that, but we don't really know how to individuate, the unit, right? Is one chicken equal to one cow? Is it 10 chickens? There are a lot of things going on that make utilitarianism an awkward moral system for thinking about what's the best way to treat animals. And you could even say with animals, well, as long as more survive than die, it doesn't really matter what we do to them. So as long as we have an increasing number of survivors. And so you come to the conclusion that we need something like deontology. We have to look at these animals as units that are worthy of our respect. When it comes to harming them, we have to do it in a humane way, in a kind way. We have to have some respect for it. But then you talk about the effects on the human population. And what's really interesting is then the moral system switches back to utilitarianism and consequentialism, right? I mean, if we don't stop abusing these antibiotics in raising animals for their products, it's going to have bad consequences for us. So we have utilitarianism for humans, but deontology for animals. And the question is, well, why is that?
Ever since I had originally kind of had seeds of this project in your class in philosophy of disaster, that's really been a question to me, because it has always been my inclination that we should go to a deontological model for both humans and non-humans. And utilitarianism has value, but I think in some cases it causes more violence than actual good in the world. And I've really thought about, why, you're right, why I have these two moral theories. At first, in the non-human animal ethics, I say that it's not valuable to this project, and then I come back to it eventually and argue it in that way. And I think that for me, it comes down to the concrete risk that this problem represents. I think that going to a deontological model for human populations is a place that we need to strive for, a place that we need to go towards. And I think that if I had, more time and more energy and things like that, I think that I would have gone through a similar process with my second part, maybe going through, like I did in the first part, utilitarianism, deontology, and going through the same evaluation that I did before. But I think that in terms of this problem, time is really of the essence.
Okay, no, I mean, there are endless discussions in moral theory back and forth as to, which is a better approach, deontology or utilitarianism. I think one thing you could say, this is what occurred to me, is that the reason we need to apply deontology to animals in order to get what we want, essentially, but we don't have to apply it to human beings, so we've already applied it to human beings. In the sense, we've already decided that human beings are so intrinsically worthwhile that, we can blind rabbits in order to make sure that their shampoo is not going to sting their eyes. So in a way, the work has already been done, although when you come to, but then when you come to something like public planning and epidemiology, the thinking is consequentialist. But all the objections are always deontological. So now the other thing, can you see how, some of that work that you're trying to do for the first time with animals was done centuries ago for human beings. Notions of human equality, notions of universal human worth, that sort of thing. But now here's an interesting question as well, I think, and that is that the way of framing this issue is our relations with non-humans, humans' relations with non-humans. But there's also an issue of humans' relations with humans, because we're living in a system where some humans encourage other humans to consume things that are very unhealthy for them, for profit. I think the fast food industry uses a disproportionate amount of those animal products. And the fast food industry has figured out that fat, salt, and sugar are almost addictive in their effects, not just on people in the United States, but anywhere in the world. Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's. People like the taste. It's like human mammals. The primates that we are, gravitate towards those tastes. You can train yourself not to do that, but the first reaction is to find that very attractive. So it's really a human-human, it's a human-human relationship as well, because if human beings had certain kind of respect for all others that they don't have, then they wouldn't be doing this to animals in order to create these type of things.
Yeah, no, I jotted down when we were talking, we do have a failure on a human level. I think when a few environmental ethicists say that we are living in an extreme anthropocentric lens, which I do agree with, we also don't treat humans very fairly, and there is a disrespect, and I think that is something to consider. If we do treat others in a deontological framework, and how we can apply that to people and non-humans, and I think that that's definitely important. That's kind of where I was going in my in part of the part one of the last points that I make is the interdependence between social and environmental interdependence, and how those two plan one another, and the way that we treat humans is also reflected on how we treat non-human animals, and vice versa. They're part of, I think, the same paradigm that we live in, the same extreme instrumentalist paradigm that we currently situate ourselves in. And so I think, not just framing it about non-humans and the human relation, I think it's important to break that down. But I think, like you said, it's only one symptom of the greater cause, of the greater problem that we have. It's not just that, we treat non-humans fairly because of X, Y, Z.
Okay, good. So now we can have questions. Did you have any other questions?
I would like to ask one more. Okay, but there are situations where this isn't a major approach. I'm thinking of a country like Bolivia and I believe Ecuador that have actually passed legislation, acknowledging the rights of nature. So, what do you think is going on that is a block or a kind of movement elsewhere?
I would have to kind of, I think, to fully answer that question, look at the cultures and the histories of certain places where that's happening. Like, for example, in Thailand, like Buddhist monks bless certain trees so they won't be cut down. And so those kind of resistance movements are happening. But I think as a dominant framework, I think, at least a Western West framework, I think that you can definitely see that's very apparent. But I think, in terms of why it's not happening in other places, I think the values and norms and cultures kind of differentiate that. Buddhism, I took a nonviolent social justice compassion class at Oregon State about Buddhism, and we talked about environmentalism and how Buddhism fits into that. And without romanticizing or idealizing Buddhism in any way or reducing it to anything, I think that it does offer some sort of environmental ethic, and I think that does play a part in their culture. I think you can see in every nation some sort of environmental degradation. But I think it is important to look at those kind of exceptions to the rule and why they're happening, and without reducing it to anything, but also trying to appropriate them into a society like the United States, which may have different cultures and norms.
So it puts the focus back on the importance of philosophy that you've drawn attention to, and it opens up the concept of philosophy in terms of what you're going to look at. Which philosophies.
Glad that you said that. So, do you have any other questions?
Well, I would just like to suggest that perhaps the U.S. Congress should hire a bunch of philosophers.
Right. Well, there are philosophers and then philosophers.
Well, I know. Maybe that's right.
Agree. I mean, they can hire a bunch of evil philosophers.
Hire Ryan Rand.
Yeah,
And they have some of their own business.
Do we have questions from the audience? Yeah.
I have one. This is my right-wing question of the day. If I understood correctly, your argument suggests, I wrote it down so I don't forget. Your argument suggests that philosophically and factually informed policy, Congress, whatever the body may be, would lead the way to reforming antibiotic practices for the benefit of all animals, human animals, non-human animals, etc., as I understood it. However, I'm no philosopher, but here's my attempt. However, if changing antibiotic practices is an ethically complex issue that crosses national borders, what are the ethical or philosophical guidelines by which policy could be implemented? If it's an international issue, is it ethical to make that kind of legislation by one government, or ethically should antibiotics be left to something wonderful like market forces? I understand that there are ramifications, but ethically, can a government do that?
Well, legally they can.
Right.
That's all you need with governments,
I guess I'm looking for a John Locke argument. What's government's role?
Yeah, so I think that for combating this issue, I'm going to step back a little from the question. I think that it is definitely a synthesis of policy, but then also a change in cultural shifts and norms. And so hopefully, and I'm not trying to say chicken before the egg, but those kind of may be interrelated and work with each other. I don't think it's extreme for a government to institute regulations like this. I don't think they're overstepping their boundaries in any way. But I do also think that it is important to consider global perspectives. And, limiting antibiotic use and saying that every country must do that in a certain way, I think could be potentially damaging to, countries that are in a more unfair position than the United States. And so I think that is definitely a consideration that needs to be addressed. But I think, like I said, the global open source labs, more discussion on a global scale, through the World Health Organization, through other initiatives that are starting, I think that kind of combats the issue of, maybe a Western state dominating, legislation or saying to another country that they need to do X. Because it is going to be country dependent. Countries have different uses, things like that. So, it is a global scale, but I'm definitely not advocating for one blanket solution for every country to have.
Thank you. Now I have to sit down.
Well, I'd like to step in that point and suggest that you can't, there are no sold, isn't that true?
Yes. And I think,
Well, the Chinese and the Japanese are buying a great deal of American beef now. There's a beef shortage and there's a meat shortage in lots of parts of this country because of that and the drought. And that meat is going over there.
I think also that just, human transportation is also a very important consideration along those lines. How easy it is to get from one time zone to another in a matter of 12 hours. And that's a very serious risk. I talk about contagion in my thesis. And although, I do think that they, glamorize what an epidemic would look like in this country, I don't think it's far off, the main character coming back from somewhere, China, wherever, Europe, and coming to the United States and transmitting that. I think that is a very serious risk, and I think that's part of why there is so much concern, because a lot of the bacteria are also silent carriers. People can be silent carriers, and so people will maybe not even be aware that they're carrying certain bacteria.
So we have that with, what is it called? MERS. MERS.
We just accounted today.
Yeah.
It's in the on there.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, and that, does everybody know what that is? Yeah, do you know? Well, it's a virus, right, that crosses the species barrier from camels. So people contract it in the Middle East, and if it comes to the United States, it's highly contagious, and the mortality rate is 30%. So that's pretty scary. But the way, there are cases in Florida, exactly because somebody brought them, somebody brought an airplane. On the other hand, this could be, as I'm actually describing all this could be another sort of terrorist mass panic, right? I mean, it's weird.
Weird about that.
Middle East and camels,
Yeah.
And although I didn't really talk about viruses, I think they're also very important in this discussion in terms of, talking about how we can prepare for an epidemic, not just bacterial epidemic, but also a viral epidemic. And the same kind of considerations and methods, some of them that I talked about, I think can be applicable to, a virus like SARS and MERS.
Do they give these animals antivirals as well? In CAFOs, give them antivirals?
Human antivirals? So about half.
Are the animals, I know the animals are on antibiotics, are they on antivirals as well?
Oh, antivirals,
Yeah.
sorry. I didn't come across any research to suggest that they were given antivirals. Maybe if, one animal is showing that, they might choose to treat just that animal, but I'm not sure in terms of transmission rates of viruses within these facilities, just because of the focus on it, but I think it's important.
Well, avian flu would be an example, right? Avian flu is
Man disease too, the
well,
prions.
it's the prions.
Yes,
So it's not just antibiotics, there might be other medications. I don't know how avian flu is managed in domestic flocks of birds and fowls. I think they just kill them.
They do, they did in China the last time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of touched on that a little bit, when an outbreak occurs,
Right.
the methods that they try to mass kill all of these animals are pretty inhumane, even more inhumane than they usually are, because there is this panic and this fear, like you're talking about, to exterminate all sick animals and to really concentrate the virus or the outbreak, whether they can or not. At that point, it might, if it is a strain that has been mutated into past to human populations, it may be too late at that point. But yeah, I do think that your
So
presentation
do you
is
think the problem is that we've gotten ourselves in a situation where we have huge populations of animals that are artificially bred? You know, they are artificially bred. I mean, we think naturally there wouldn't be such huge numbers of them if we didn't have these facilities. So it's like we've created this, I don't know what you call it. I mean, it's really an extension of the agricultural revolution but to animals, you know. The industrial, right, the combination of the agricultural and industrial revolution to animals as a source of protein. It seems very inefficient. Do you have any hope for these, you know, the new forms of non-animal protein? I think somebody, oh, yeah, well, we know about the soy products and the whey products, and they could be made a lot more palatable. But someone has grown hamburger meat.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know about that? So your reaction is typical. For some reason, that's more disgusting to us. It's creepy than it is to slaughter a cow. And
There are artists who want to make buildings out of that kind of flesh. I guess you could go start eating the door.
No, but what do you think of you know, is that possible? So you wouldn't have living beings. You would just have tissue growing on racks in factories. Would you eat it? Would people eat it?
I mean, I'm vegan, so I would consider that an animal product. So at least for me, I still wouldn't.
But what about those of you who, you know, are not vegans who eat it? Would you eat it?
Yeah, and then I could imagine that if it tasted like this.
If it tastes like chicken.
Right. Well, like, because I wonder, and the same thing, they put so much effort into soy products. Like, I was working on a video project, like they've managed to artificially sort of break down the proteins and then actually reconstruct it in similar chains to chicken, and then flavor it like chicken. So I'm like, at that point, like,
At that point, people would eat it. I think they would. I mean, I think the reason that these soy products, and there are other things besides soy that can duplicate protein, I think the reason that they're not more readily available is the interest of the meat industry.
well, and then the amount of energy, whether it's would then be energy efficient and what kind of ecological impacts we would have in producing that meat, if it would be comparably more efficient to.
It's always going to be more efficient if it's lower down on the food chain, because animal protein.
Oh, like the growing the meat.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, the growing the meat thing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it seems like it's got to be easier if it can be mass-produced to just grow the one thing you consistently use from the animal. Or maybe specialize, you know, maybe you have other racks where you have leather growing. Yeah, because you get all kinds of things from it. But is that a solution or not? Or is that too disgusting to even contemplate?
Well, I agree with you. It's kind of odd that we don't consider what we do now as unnatural and disgusting, and people are still willing to do that. In terms of, you know, they are willing to have animals suffer the way that they do, and still are able to consume it without much guilt, or if people are aware, maybe a little bit of guilt. And I feel torn on the issue because at one point I do think that it could offer. I think it could offer people who are maybe in the food justice system, it could offer solutions for people who have little access to food to have more protein-based diet because of the arguably
cheap.
the arguably lower costs.
Right.
And so I think that needs to be a consideration, how it would impact people who aren't able to afford the organic, natural grown meat.
Okay.
But I also think that the implications of such tinkering need to be addressed as well. I think that the amount of scientific information on the subject still needs to be explored and further researched. Because I don't want to sound like I'm fearful or that I'm in a panic, but you know I am concerned about jumping into something like that because it sounds so great, but also not knowing what implications it has on non-humans who are, you know, in certain other facilities, more natural-based facilities, and then also the humans humans and what kind of paradigm, what kind of norms that places in society. I think it could, yeah, I think it could have an effect on that.
So kind of off of that, I'm curious what you think, because if we did just have, you know, it seems almost like possibly a silver bullet type of issue in affecting sort of the...
Except that it's now $6,000 per hamburger, but they could get the cost down.
Right. Like, what, would that even possibly change the way that humans, like the instrumental approach to non-human animals? Or would it just lead to, you know, okay, well, we have meat from this source, but we're still going to do like animal testing, you know, or some other, like...
No, it would be a step away. I think it would be a step away from the mass production of animals. But, you know, but here's an interesting paradox. In the first generation, you know, a lot of animals would be killed, the businesses would start to get less profitable, they'd basically be wasted. There'd be untold generations of those animals that never have existence because they're no longer being bred, you know.
There's no natural space for them. And
Right.
Well, it's not certain how many resources would be required to grow that so-called meat. And
You're
the
not
whole,
eat it, are you?
no, but the whole project assumes that we are gods and can create meat. I don't believe that we would create exactly the same thing as you eat when you eat like an animal. I also do not believe that there is any purity in the world that would save you from killing things to eat them. There's increasing evidence that there are kinds of cognition is too much to call them, but there are sensing activities in plants. And when you cut a parent, you're killing it. You're killing a living thing. And you eat it, and it's crunchy, and it's nice, but it's dying. It's screaming, and you're not hearing it. I mean, how do we know? So I don't think you get out of the problem. And it's very instrumental to try and create meat without, you know.
like it seems like it's just wiping the nutrients.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say that I think that even if we step away from what we do now, I think that the problem would manifest itself in other ways that maybe are not known to us, maybe are not possible.
So what is the problem? What's the problem that will crop up in some other way?
I mean,
How would you describe the problem?
I would describe it as a furthering of the instrumentalist view and paradigm that we have now. Like I said, I don't know how that would manifest itself, but maybe in further environmental and non-human degradation, using non-human animals in other ways besides meat. Like I said, I don't want to predict the future because I have no clue what that would mean or what that would be. But I think that stepping away from at least this problem would be a step in the right direction, but it wouldn't solve, on a policy level, if we stepped away from it, it wouldn't solve the paradigm issue, it wouldn't solve the cultural and philosophical issue.
No, but it would be a good thing. I mean,
Yeah.
and at some point, I think aesthetic values have to come into this because if people are not motivated morally, they may not be. They are motivated aesthetically. So, anyway, do we have any more questions? No? Well, I will now excuse everyone except for members of the committee, and Shahnaz, don't go too far.
I passed with distinction.
Yay!